How did Africa defeat a colonial power? At a time when European powers were dividing Africa like a festive cake, one ancient empire challenged them. This is not a story of heroic defeat, but of a crushing victory that changed the course of history. In the mountains of Ethiopia, an African army armed with faith and courage faced one of the most modern armies in Europe. Italy, intoxicated by colonial ambitions, was confident of a quick and easy victory. But it was confronted by the wisdom of Emperor Menelik II, the cunning of his generals, and the unyielding will of an entire people. This battle became a symbol that even in the age of steel and gunpowder, the spirit of freedom can prevail. Watch the video to the end to find out how a mistranslated word in a treaty led to a large-scale conflict, and what tactics allowed the Ethiopian army to lure the Europeans into a perfect trap. What if I told you that one of the greatest and bloodiest wars in 19th century African history began because of a single word deliberately misinterpreted in an international treaty? It all began not with the sound of gunfire or border skirmishes, but with deceitful ink on parchment, with a diplomatic document solemnly titled the Treaty of Wuchale of 1889. This bilateral treaty, signed between the young Kingdom of Italy and the ancient Ethiopian Empire, was intended to be a symbol of friendship, mutual understanding, and mutually beneficial cooperation between European and African powers. However, the reality turned out to be completely different, and the treaty became an instrument of insidious deception and colonial expansion. The official Italian version of the treaty, written in Italian, contained a critically important Article 17, which unequivocally stated that the Emperor of Ethiopia unconditionally agrees and is obliged to conduct absolutely all of his external diplomatic relations with other states exclusively through the Italian government as an intermediary. This essentially automatically turned proud, independent Ethiopia into an Italian protectorate, completely depriving it of its international sovereignty and voice on the world stage. Insidious Italy immediately solemnly notified all other interested European powers of its alleged new legal status as the master of Ethiopia, relying on this treaty as an indisputable legal basis for its claims to African territory. However, in the parallel Amharic version of the same treaty, which was carefully read and personally signed by the trusting Emperor Menelik II, who did not know Italian, the same critical Article 17 sounded completely and radically different in meaning and legal consequences. The Amharic text merely stated that the emperor, at his own discretion, may or has the right to voluntarily use the diplomatic services of Italian representatives if he deems it convenient. It was a polite offer of voluntary assistance and cooperation, not a harsh demand for unconditional submission and renunciation of sovereignty. The difference was enormous and changed the whole essence of the treaty from a partnership to a colonial one. This was not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate deception on the part of the Italians, who counted on the Africans' ignorance of European languages. The cynical deception was exposed when the perceptive Menelik II gradually began to notice alarming signs that his direct diplomatic contacts with other independent countries were being systematically ignored without explanation. European leaders and monarchs invariably responded to him exclusively through Rome as an intermediary, or did not respond at all, formally referring to the provisions of the Treaty of Wuchale and the Italian Protectorate. The offended emperor, gradually realizing the monstrous scale of Italian betrayal and humiliation, flew into a righteous rage and felt cheated. His trust had been cynically used against him, and he understood that he had fallen victim to a colonial deception aimed at enslaving his people. Menelik II was not a naive, inexperienced ruler who could be easily deceived by fine words or intimidated by threats. He was an experienced, sophisticated diplomat and a talented politician who had successfully united a fragmented country after decades of feudal fragmentation and civil strife. He understood perfectly well the fundamental difference between an equal union of sovereign states and humiliating subjugation to colonial power. Menelik was well educated, knew history, and understood what was happening in Africa, where Europeans were seizing one territory after another, using precisely such trap treaties. The wise emperor initially attempted to resolve the brewing conflict through civilized diplomatic means, officially pointing out to the Italians the glaring inconsistency in the texts of the two versions of the treaty and demanding an explanation. But arrogant Rome, confident in its military and technical superiority and colonial right of the strong over the weak, categorically refused to make any concessions or admit to deception. For the cynical Italian colonialists, this controversial treaty was a convenient legal basis and pretext for the legal seizure of a rich African country, and they had no intention of renouncing it. Italy saw Ethiopia as easy prey that would compensate for their lag behind Britain and France in the colonial race. A disappointed Menelik II finally realized that diplomatic words and negotiations no longer had any power with such partners. He decisively and publicly terminated the humiliating Treaty of Wuchale in 1893, solemnly declaring to the entire civilized world that proud Ethiopia would never, under any circumstances, voluntarily renounce its millennial independence and sovereignty. This historic, bold move by the emperor was effectively tantamount to a formal declaration of war on a powerful European power, and everyone understood this. Menelik challenged the entire European colonial system, showing that Africans were ready to fight for their freedom. Insulted Italy perceived the termination of the treaty as an unacceptable challenge to its honor and prestige, which could not be left without a harsh response in front of other powers. Italian nationalist newspapers and politicians hysterically demanded that the uncivilized and savage African ruler be punished immediately with military force, and that everyone be shown who was in charge. Thus, tragically, because of a cynical linguistic trap in the treaty and the boundless imperial arrogance of the colonialists, who despised Africans, two nations found themselves on the brink of a decisive and bloody military confrontation that would go down in history. This clash would become one of the greatest battles in the history of colonialism and prove that African peoples were capable of defending their independence from European invaders. It would be very interesting to hear your balanced opinion on this situation. What exactly do you think about the critical role of diplomacy, international treaties, and similar deliberate translation difficulties in the global history of conflicts and wars? Please write about this in detail in the comments below. Are you ready to learn the truth about how an ancient empire assembled an army whose size and organization shocked the European invaders? Upon receiving news of the inevitability of conflict, Emperor Menelik II issued a decree of general mobilization. This call spread throughout the vast country, from mountain fortresses to fertile valleys. What followed was unprecedented on the African continent. Tens of thousands of warriors from all corners of the empire began to flock to the capital. It was not just an army, but the entire Ethiopian people rising to defend their homeland. The mobilization was based on the traditional feudal system. Each regional ruler, or RAS, brought his own army with him. These warriors were loyal to their leaders and, ultimately, to the emperor, who managed to unite them all under one banner. The logistics of this grand campaign were a marvel of organization. The Ethiopians had no railways or modern trucks. The huge army was supplied by food depots set up in advance along the route and by the support of the local population. Every village along the army's route considered it their duty to feed and shelter the soldiers. Women baked bread, peasants gave grain and livestock. It was truly a people's war, where the front and the rear were one. Italian intelligence grossly miscalculated Ethiopia's mobilization potential. They expected to see scattered tribal militias, but instead encountered a unified, motivated, and enormous army of more than 100,000 men. It was an army comparable in size to the European armies of the time. The Ethiopian army's weaponry also came as a surprise to the Italians. Menelik II, anticipating conflict, had spent years purchasing modern firearms from the French and Russians. Many of his soldiers were armed with rifles that were on par with Italian ones. The morale of this army was incredibly high. The soldiers went into battle not for pay, but for their land, their faith, and their independence, which had been preserved for millennia. They knew they had nowhere to retreat. Thus, by the end of 1895, Menelik II had gathered a huge force at the foot of the mountains. He was ready to meet the European invader and fight him on his own terms. The unity of the nation became his main weapon. What do you think is more important for winning a war? Technological superiority or the unity and morale of a nation? In the next chapter, we will talk about the emperor's secret weapon. His wife, who was no less formidable a strategist than he was. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Ethiopian court. Behind every great victory of Emperor Menelik II stood the shadow of his wife, Empress Taytu. She was not just the ruler's spouse, but his chief advisor, a brilliant strategist, and the most ardent opponent of colonialism in the country. Taytu came from a distinguished aristocratic family and received an excellent education. She was known for her sharp mind, strong character, and deep understanding of politics. Many at court feared her more than the emperor himself. It was Taytu who was one of the first to recognize the trap in the Wuchale Treaty. From the very beginning, she did not trust the Italians and persuaded Menelik not to make any concessions that could undermine Ethiopia's sovereignty. Her position was uncompromising. Freedom cannot be a subject of bargaining. The Empress took an active part in all military councils. Her opinion was valued as much as that of the most experienced generals. She insisted on thorough preparation for war, the purchase of weapons, and the creation of food reserves. But Taytu's role was not limited to politics. She personally led her own military contingent of several thousand men and went on campaign with the army. Her presence on the battlefield inspired the soldiers and demonstrated the unity of the ruling couple. Taytu was not only a warrior, but also a skilled diplomat. She founded the future capital of the country, Addis Ababa, choosing a strategically important location for it. Her decisions determined the future of Ethiopia for decades to come. During the campaign, she was responsible for many aspects of logistics and intelligence. Her people gathered valuable information about the movements of the Italians. The Empress personally ensured that the army was fed and provided with everything it needed. Her hatred for the invaders was so strong that she became the driving force behind the resistance. When some advisors suggested that Menelik negotiate, it was Taytu's firm words that convinced him to continue fighting until complete victory. She was the conscience and iron will of the nation. The story of Empress Taytu is a unique example of a female leader in the 19th century. She proved that wisdom and courage have no gender. Her contribution to the victory at Adwa was no less than that of the emperor himself and his generals. What if the most powerful weapon is not a cannon, but patience? Realizing the Italians' technological advantage in artillery, Menelik II chose the only correct strategy. He refused to engage in a decisive battle on the border and began a slow retreat deep into his country. It was a brilliant tactical move that turned the entire campaign into an exhausting game of cat and mouse. The Italian army, which had been counting on a quick victory, was forced to pursue the Ethiopian troops through hostile, unfamiliar terrain. Every step deeper into Ethiopia stretched their supply lines. The Ethiopian highlands became Menelik's main ally. Narrow mountain trails, deep gorges, and steep elevation changes exhausted Italian soldiers and their pack animals. What was home to the Ethiopians became a veritable green hell for the Europeans. The emperor led his army along well-known routes, where secret food depots had been prepared in advance. The Italians, on the other hand, suffered from a lack of food, water, and ammunition. Their logistics, designed for European conditions, proved completely unprepared for the realities of Africa. Ethiopian guerrilla units constantly harassed Italian columns. They made sudden raids on supply trains, disrupted communications, and disappeared into the mountains before the enemy had time to organize resistance. This created constant tension and undermined the morale of the invaders. General Oreste Baratieri, commander of the Italian forces, found himself trapped. He could not catch up with Menelik's main army, but he could not retreat either. That would be seen in Rome as a sign of cowardice. He was forced to go further and further into the heart of the trap set by the emperor. Menelik, meanwhile, wasted no time. While retreating, he continued to gather troops, and his army grew day by day. He waited for the perfect moment to strike, when the enemy would be at its weakest and most demoralized. This strategy required enormous patience and endurance. Some of his generals grumbled, demanding to attack the enemy immediately. But the emperor, supported by the wise Taytu, remained adamant, trusting his plan. So, step by step, Menelik lured the Italian army to the place he himself had chosen for the decisive battle. It was a place called Adwa. The terrain here was so difficult that it negated all the advantages of the European army. Are you ready to find out how the Ethiopians managed to feed an army of 100,000 far from their supply bases? The success of Menelik II's strategy would have been impossible without a phenomenal supply system. While the Italian army suffered from hunger, the huge Ethiopian army was well fed and provided with everything it needed. This invisible battle for resources was won even before the main battle began. The basis of Ethiopian logistics was a decentralized system, relying on the support of the entire population. Along the army's route, gibri were created, huge food warehouses. Local governors and peasants brought grain, flour, dried meat, and other supplies there in advance. In addition, the army was accompanied by giant convoys. Tens of thousands of women, servants, and drivers followed the army, carrying pots, bags of food, and water skins on themselves and on mules. It was a real city on the march, capable of providing for itself. Empress Taytu personally supervised the distribution of provisions. She made sure that each unit received its share on time. This strict discipline prevented starvation and maintained order among the huge mass of people. The Italian supply system was the complete opposite. It was centralized and depended on a single road leading from the port of Massawa. This road was constantly under attack by partisans. Italian soldiers received meager rations consisting mainly of hardtack and canned food. The lack of fresh food and clean water led to disease. The morale of an army forced to fight on an empty stomach steadily declined. The Ethiopians, on the other hand, ate fresh food that they were accustomed to. This not only sustained their physical strength, but also created a sense of a home war. They fought on their own land and fed on its fruits. The ability to feed such a huge army in roadless and mountainous terrain was one of Menelik's greatest achievements. It demonstrated the highest level of organization and unity of Ethiopian society. In this war, logistics proved to be no less important a weapon than rifles. The contrast between the two supply systems was striking. On the one hand, there was an army supported by the entire country. On the other, there was an isolated expeditionary force, abandoned to its fate thousands of kilometers from home. Thus, even before the Battle of Adwa, the Italian army was half defeated. It was exhausted by hunger, disease, and constant tension. The Ethiopian army, on the contrary, was full of strength and ready for a decisive battle. I will reveal a secret that sealed the fate of an entire European army long before the first shot was fired. General Oreste Baratieri, commander of the Italian forces, was an ambitious and self-confident man. He despised the Ethiopians, considering them an unorganized mob incapable of resisting a disciplined European army. This arrogance blinded him. Baratieri completely ignored reports from his own intelligence service warning of the enormous size of Menelik's army. He believed only information that confirmed his own opinion of the enemy's weakness. The Ethiopian intelligence service, headed by Ras Makonnen, took brilliant advantage of this. He created a whole network of double agents who supplied the Italian headquarters with cleverly fabricated disinformation. These agents reported that the Ethiopian army was suffering from hunger, disease, and desertion. They painted a picture of a collapsing army, ready to flee at the first serious attack. Baratieri gladly accepted these false reports. They fit perfectly into his plans and justified the risky offensive. The government in Rome also put enormous pressure on the general. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi demanded an immediate and resounding victory to strengthen his political position. In his telegrams, he reproached Baratieri for indecision and cowardice. Yielding to this pressure and believing the misinformation, Baratieri made a fatal mistake. He decided to attack Menelik's army despite the extreme exhaustion of his own troops and his unfavorable position. He wanted to fight one decisive battle, which he thought would bring him glory. Ethiopian intelligence also provided the Italians with inaccurate maps of the area. These maps concealed the true complexity of the terrain around Adwa. Baratieri planned his attack based on false information, which ultimately led to disaster. On the night before the battle, one of the double agents informed the Italians that Menelik was planning to retreat. This was the last straw. Fearing that he would miss out on easy prey, Baratieri gave the order for an immediate night march and an attack at dawn. Thus, arrogance, political pressure, and the brilliant work of Ethiopian spies lured the Italian army into a deadly trap. General Baratieri led his soldiers not to victory, but to complete defeat. What do you think leads to defeat more often? The weakness of the army or the mistakes of its command? In the next chapter, we will take a detailed look at the battlefield itself and understand why it became the perfect trap. The terrain around the city of Adwa was not just the site of the battle, it was an active participant in the battle. Menelik II did not choose this position by chance. He knew that the complex terrain of the area would be his best general, fighting on his side. The Adwa Valley is surrounded by a chain of high, rocky hills and extinct volcanoes. It is cut by many deep and winding gorges that create a natural labyrinth. Navigating this chaos of peaks and valleys was extremely difficult, even for the locals. For the Italian army, accustomed to the plains of Europe, this terrain was completely unfamiliar. Their artillery, the main advantage of the Europeans, lost its effectiveness here. It was difficult to move the guns along the narrow paths, and the folds of the terrain created many dead zones that were inaccessible to fire. Menelik positioned his huge army on the hills surrounding the valley. His soldiers were hidden from the enemy's view and occupied the dominant heights. They knew every rock and every ravine on this battlefield perfectly. The Italian offensive plan, based on inaccurate maps, involved moving in 3 separate columns. In rough terrain and poor visibility, these columns quickly lost visual contact with each other. There was virtually no communication between them. Thus, geography itself divided the Italian army even before the battle began. Instead of a single powerful fist, Baratieri received 3 isolated brigades wandering in a maze of rocks. This gave the Ethiopians the opportunity to attack them in parts. The Ethiopian warriors, on the other hand, used the terrain to their maximum advantage. They could move quickly and quietly along familiar paths, concentrating their forces in the right direction. They appeared from gorges and hilltops, where they were completely unexpected. The difficult terrain also prevented the Italians from using their classic linear tactics. Their battalions could not deploy in proper battle formations. The battle almost immediately broke down into a series of small, chaotic skirmishes, where discipline and order lost their meaning. Thus, the choice of battlefield was a strategic masterpiece. Menelik II made nature fight for him. He turned the strengths of the Italian army, its artillery and discipline, into its main weaknesses. On the night of March 1st, 1896, 3 Italian columns began their grueling march toward the Ethiopian positions. The soldiers were exhausted from hunger and lack of sleep. They moved in complete darkness through unfamiliar terrain, guided by inaccurate maps. General Baratieri's plan was simple: to occupy the dominant heights at dawn and attack the Ethiopian camp. However, due to confusion and difficult terrain, everything went wrong from the start. The columns lost their way, confusing the hills they were supposed to occupy. As a result of this chaos, the central and left columns collided with each other in a narrow gorge, creating a traffic jam and losing precious time. The right column, on the contrary, went far ahead and to the side, completely breaking away from the main forces. The Italian army found itself disorganized and disoriented. Ethiopian scouts immediately reported the enemy's strange maneuvers to Menelik. At first, the emperor could not believe that the Italians were walking into a trap, but when the reports were confirmed, he gave the order for a general attack. The first blow was taken by General Albertone's detached right column. It was attacked from the front and flanks by superior Ethiopian forces. A fierce battle ensued, in which the Italian soldiers, despite desperate resistance, were quickly surrounded. Hearing the sounds of battle, Baratieri realized that his plan had failed. He tried to send the central column to help Albertone, but it was too late. Ethiopian troops had already wedged themselves into the gaps between the Italian brigades. By noon, the outcome of the battle was clear. The Italian army had been completely defeated. Its columns had been broken up individually, unable to support each other. The results of the Battle of Adwa shocked the whole world. It was not just a defeat, but a complete and crushing defeat of a modern European army. The scale of the disaster exceeded all the Ethiopians' wildest expectations and the Italians' worst fears. The Italian army lost more than half of its personnel. Thousands of soldiers and officers were left lying on the battlefield, and several thousand more were taken prisoner. The Ethiopian losses were also significant, but they were acceptable for such a huge army and justified by the great victory. The Ethiopians captured a huge amount of trophies. They seized all the Italian artillery, dozens of modern mountain guns. More than 11,000 rifles and a huge amount of ammunition were also captured. In essence, Menelik II not only defeated the enemy army, but also rearmed his own at the expense of the enemy. These trophies strengthened Ethiopia's military power for many years to come. The victory was complete and unconditional. The news of the defeat at Adwa caused a real shock and political crisis in Italy. Mass demonstrations began in major cities, demanding an end to the war. The government of Prime Minister Crispi, the main initiator of the adventure, was forced to resign. The victory at Adwa was not achieved by a miracle, but thanks to a number of factors. These included Menelik's wise strategy, the unity of the nation, the brilliant work of intelligence, and the mistakes of the Italian command. It was a triumph of reason and will over brute force. The historic victory at Adwa on March 1, 1896, had far-reaching and profound consequences that extended far beyond Ethiopia itself and resonated throughout the world. It forever changed the political map of Africa and became a powerful and inspiring symbol of hope for all the oppressed peoples of the world fighting for freedom from colonialism. This legendary battle was not simply a military tactical triumph of one army over another, but a true ideological victory of Africans over European racism and colonialism, proving the equality of races. Adwa shattered the myth of the invincibility of the white man and his civilizing mission, showing that Africans were capable of fighting Europeans on equal terms and defeating them. The main immediate result of the battle was the successful preservation of Ethiopia's complete independence and sovereignty as a state. At the height of the so-called Scramble for Africa, or Battle for Africa, when virtually the entire vast continent was ruthlessly divided up among greedy European colonial powers at the Berlin Conference, proud Ethiopia remained the only island of true sovereignty and freedom on the map. It became living proof that active armed resistance to colonialism is not only possible, but can also be successful if properly organized. Ethiopia proved that African states can defend their independence if they are willing to fight for it to the end. For the many peoples of Africa and the African diaspora around the world, especially in the Americas and the Caribbean, Adwa instantly became a shining beacon of hope in the dark times of colonial oppression. The incredible news of the crushing victory of the Black African Army over the well-armed white European army spread across the continent like wildfire, inspiring and encouraging the first anti-colonial liberation movements and uprisings. Independent Ethiopia instantly became a powerful symbol of African pride, dignity, and the possibility of freedom for all oppressed peoples. People across Africa said, if the Ethiopians could defeat the Italians, then we too could free ourselves from colonial rule. The triumphant victory at Adwa gave an incredibly powerful ideological boost to the development of Pan-Africanism as a political movement of solidarity. Outstanding leaders and progressive intellectuals who fought selflessly for the civil rights of black people around the world saw independent Ethiopia as a shining example to emulate and inspire. The influence of the historic Battle of Adwa continued to be felt throughout the turbulent 20th century in the processes of decolonization. Many charismatic leaders of African countries that gained long-awaited independence in the wave of decolonization in the 1950s and 60s repeatedly mentioned Adwa as the main source of their inspiration and belief in the possibility of freedom. The tricolor green-yellow-red flag of Ethiopia became a sacred foundation and model for the national flags of many new independent African states, symbolizing Pan-African unity. The colors of the Ethiopian flag became the colors of a free Africa, adopted by dozens of countries from Ghana to Mali. In Italy itself, the crushing defeat at Adwa left a deep, unhealed national trauma and an inferiority complex. For many decades, it significantly dampened the country's colonial imperial ambitions and its desire for overseas possessions. It was only with the rise to absolute power of the fascist dictator Mussolini in the 1920s that the idea of bloody revenge for the humiliating Adwa defeat once again became central to the aggressive state ideology. Mussolini was obsessed with washing away the shame of Adwa and proving the superiority of the Italian race, which led to a second invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 with the use of chemical weapons. This is an invaluable historical lesson about the power of unity, strategy, and determination, which remains relevant and inspiring to this day for all peoples fighting for their freedom against superior forces. The Battle of Adwa is not just a page in a history book. It is a grand saga of wisdom, cunning, and an unyielding will for freedom. It shows how an entire people, united by a common goal, was able to defeat a powerful empire, forcing it to play by their rules. Menelik II and Taytu Betul used all the resources at their disposal: national unity, knowledge of the terrain, diplomatic dexterity, and military cunning. They turned their perceived weaknesses into formidable weapons, proving that in war it is not the one with the most guns who wins, but the one who better understands its essence. The story of the victory at Adwa teaches us that we must not underestimate our enemies and that arrogance is the shortest path to defeat. It is an eternal hymn to the human spirit, which even in the darkest era of colonialism managed to ignite the flame of hope for an entire continent. What other examples of such impossible victories in history do you know? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research into the great battles of the past.